guys were talking about the great years when we were building things back in the 80s.
Right.
Those are gone
exactly,
now.
Yes. Yes. They have to be revisited.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a great opening. For what I'm going to just say is a few words just to open up some of what our content is that we're going to go through today. I'm really happy actually that there's just a few people who showed up. It's nice, cozy and social and laid back. It's not formal and stuffy, so that's great. So welcome everybody. This is our first official Rising Tide Foundation presentation in Vancouver.
Yay!
Finally. So we started this foundation up earlier last year in order to sort of fill a vacuum. Both Cynthia and I had been already writing for a while, encountering a lot of professionals in the geopolitical world, people whose profession is to provide analysis of world events. One of the problems was that there was a lack of solution orientation, and obviously it's wonderful to be able to dissect world problems, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in the oncoming economic collapse, whether it's in the emergence of a banker's dictatorship. It's wonderful to be able to dissect and to talk about how bad it is, but ultimately it's really impotent because it doesn't empower you to change anything. And so that attitude that we once seen as, I guess, a little bit more normal. It was never a normal thing, but it was more common, I suppose, to sort of see this Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Kennedy, Frederick Douglass spirit in society before a lot of us were born, or if we were born, we were very young. And it's not really much of an active reality in our current world. So the idea of the Rising Tide Foundation was to provide that sort of more historical, educational, cultural aspect to geopolitics and to world history that would give people the edge to understand where, yes, it's unfortunate that society has been under the grips of empire, of oligarchy for a very long time, but where have those oligarchs, where has this system of empire lost power? Under what organizations, what sets of ideas has resulted in increased rates of emancipation of human beings, increased rates of freedom in humankind, in opposition to this other way of organizing society around a master class trying to manage a bunch of beasts, thinking that they're humans on a plantation of some form, right? And this plantation doesn't have to be literal, it can be a plantation of the mind, or as Aldous Huxley said, a concentration camp of the mind, which is the most effective way of organizing people, right? Is you get them to love their shackles, because they don't see them, they don't feel bad, they actually feel kind of good. So, some of you have seen our advertisement, the historic clash between open versus closed systems, and I'd like to just bring people's attention to the background which we chose, because when looking at the Earth, you have a choice to see it, as the name of this little seminar implies, as something which is a finite little globe with finite resources and finite territory in a finite space of time, moving around the sun in an otherwise cold, dark vacuum, right? And this is all that there is, that we have to adapt to, are these limitations. And that's one choice, to look at it that way and to organize your identity, your society around that modality. Or you can look at it as something which is an open system. Maybe this growth of life, of the biosphere over the last 500 million or more years since the Precambrian period, maybe this growth is actually creative and it has a quality of always going beyond its limits by generating within itself new forms of organization, new forms of technology like photosynthesis that didn't exist previously to a certain period, but that the appearance of chlorophyll allowed for a greater power to transform solar energy into usefulness within life to sustain more life. Right, that gave life a greater ability to spread, to colonize, to grow, and to thrive, and to have more creative innovations along the way. And somewhere along the way, a species appeared that was capable of self-reflecting on that entire process. And unlike the animals, other animals in the biosphere, human beings, I mean, this is just a little picture of Europe here, had this quality where we don't run away from fire. Other species run away from fire. And where human beings, we tend to actually be curious. We can overcome our fear of fire and to look at causality to generate and control fire for cooking food, for keeping us warm in hostile environments, and for eventually adapting and creating new forms of fire that involve burning things from wood that's limited, but then we can burn coal, we can go on to different forms of electric fire, as Benjamin Franklin discovered, and apply these things to allow our species to thrive, to sustain better quality of life, and to essentially have an ever greater chance of making things better. Or we can choose to, as we've seen too many times, forget that quality of ourselves and just simply live on what exists, monopolize what exists, what resources exist, and just wind down the system, draw down the resources that are only there because of the current technological level. We're obviously of a more open system orientation ourselves. That's our philosophical orientation, and we believe that anybody who adopts that view has more creative problem-solving opportunities in front of them when dealing with problems of the world. Not only that, we're also making the point in a lot of our writings on the website and a lot of our writings geopolitically, you'll find that the multipolar system that has come to rise, especially with the announcement in 2013 of the Belt and Road Initiative that was made public by Xi Jinping, that there is a multipolar alliance versus a unipolar alliance. That there's not just one dominant economic order on the world anymore. You have two clashing systems, two different paradigms that are coming into direct conflict. And that all of the problems that we find, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in the bombings of Lebanon, or whether it's in whatever else is going on in Africa, these are shadows of the clash of these two systems. Just quickly, I said Lebanon, so let me just say this quickly. Everything going on right now, and this has been a very busy 2 weeks since these explosions happened and the government of Lebanon resigned, stepped down. We don't really know the future of this very, very strategically important zone of the world. This is where the East meets the West. This is right, Lebanon has the port of Beirut. This is directly an intersection to the Mediterranean, to Europe, but also to Africa. Anybody who could stabilize that region, who could create a framework of cooperation in that Middle Eastern zone, really can change the world. And the fact that Russia and China both have agreements to create a Russia, China, Iran triangle. Russia and Iran, as we know, they're in the middle of solidifying their extension of their 20-year agreement that was first created in 2001. That's expiring, and they're in the midst of extending that an additional 20 years. That's based on security, energy, and military cooperation. Russia, as we know, have helped Iran build their last nuclear reactor that was stopped in the revolution in the 80s. China's as well fulfilling right now the endpoints of a very important $400 billion security and economic agreement as well with Iran. These things are very, very important because if this can be brought in opposition to those who wish to just sanction and destroy Iran, this could completely transform not just that one important zone, but again, Iran has programs to build rail from China through Iran to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon to the Middle East and then into Africa. These are all programs that are very advanced, more than people realize, and this is behind a lot of the attempts to just light fires everywhere. Putin, when I talk about the multipolar alliance, just to get a point across that this is, there's a whole philosophical depth behind it that is not being conveyed in our media. Putin had a conference last summer, it was actually, I'll tell you what the conference was, but he said, dealing with the issue of technology and human economy, it was an energy conference, it's a certain type of energy. He said, it is impossible and pointless to try to stop human progress. The question is, which base can this progress realistically be built upon to achieve the Millennium Development Goals set by the United Nations? These goals are essentially to end world hunger, right? A very, very noble aspiration. Now, at this point, okay, these goals are good, but how are you going to do it? Like that matters, it's very important. And he makes the point, super efficient scientific engineering and manufacturing solutions will help us establish a balance between the biosphere and the technosphere. Fusion energy, which in fact is similar to how heat and light are produced in our star, the sun, is an example of such nature-like technologies. This was a fusion energy conference in Russia, in St. Petersburg. And the point was, obviously oil, natural gas, coal, these are fine things to have, but they're not there forever. So what are we going to think about for the next phase of our development? And the second, animals they don't have a concept of the earth as a whole. They don't have a concept of boundary conditions. They adapt based on their genetics and their environment to whatever their environment gives them. Human beings we have those qualities materially, but we have the additional factor of concepts. We have concepts of the past, the future, and boundary conditions. Those boundary conditions allow us to think about the future in ways that no other animal can do. And then the question is just, do we choose to adapt to those limits, or do we choose to circumvent them, right? Are you Prince Philip, who says, let's adapt to the limits to growth by killing more people and lowering the world population maybe 1 billion? That's one way to solve the population problem of lack of resources. Or are you going to maybe unshackle people's minds and permit them to actualize their creative powers that they have within themselves because they're human? Are you going to let them be creative? Empires obviously don't like that, because empires lose their power when people are creative, because then they question things that they would otherwise be inclined to just adapt to without questioning. So that's the paradox for the empires to deal with. We don't have to deal with that. We're not imperialists. Putin, based on his philosophy and his actions, doesn't strike me in any way as an imperialist either. A point that's going to touch on the point of this current presentation, and for those watching online, this is important. Putin, in January, first laid out a call for the P5, 5 permanent members of the United Nations who have veto power, an emergency meeting to reorganize the world economic security architecture. Putin, in this small excerpt I chose, he's since restated this call several times, and it's going to manifest approximately by the end of September, unless it's sabotaged. And this is Russia, China, the US, France. What's the other one?
India?
India?
No. I'm forgetting it, that's embarrassing, but that's okay. We'll correct it later. He says the founding countries of the United Nations should set an example. It is the 5 nuclear powers that bear a special responsibility for the conservation and sustainable development of humankind. These 5 nations should first of all start with measures to remove the prerequisites for a global war and develop updated approaches to ensuring stability on the planet that would fully take into account the political, economic, and military aspects of modern international relations. So far, he's gotten a lot of flack because people have actually, I've encountered, called him either just naive to think that this could work, or I've heard people get aggressive and actually call him like a crypto globalist, because he believes that the United Nations could play some positive role in the world, when we know how corrupt it is, which is a fact. But I think that Putin also is smart, and I think that he's smarter than a lot of people making these commentaries. And what we're getting at, if you take the previous quote of his concept of the technosphere as a part of nature, that you have the biosphere, but the technosphere, and this is a concept that goes back a very long time to the days of Plato, that human beings are similar to other forms of life, but we're also, because of our creative reason, our powers of eureka, of making discoveries that other animals don't seem to have, we can translate that and express it in new forms of discovery, right? New forms of inventions, technologies that allow us to translate back to have a higher quality of life. We don't have to just send grandpa out into the snow to die in the Arctic, or go into the tar pit. We could actually sustain people and keep them alive and cherish their minds, so that they can be contributors until they're until they're over 100 years old, if we do things right. The technosphere is really an important concept. And this is in opposition to those who talk about things like the Green New Deal, or many of the forms or types of environmentalism that we tend to encounter a lot in the West, that tend to say, no, there's a divide. There's nature, it has equilibrium, and then there's humans, we're disequilibrium because of the mind. That's not natural, because it causes disequilibrium to nature. Whenever we discover something new, we change nature. We build a dam, we change nature, and that's always bad, right? There's this leap, right, that just goes to that is bad, because disequilibrium is bad. Putin is coming at it from a very different worldview, where he's saying that yes, the mind changes nature. Yes, you can green a desert, you could do things like that, and it could be bad. Sometimes it could be destructive, or it could be natural. And the mind is a part of nature, and what it does is a part of nature. And so the idea of technosphere is a profound concept, and it's a very American concept, not the America that we know today. The idea of a multipolar alliance that Putin, Xi Jinping, and other leaders who are associated with the BRICS, with the Eurasian Economic Union, and other nations that want development in Africa and South America, this idea is not unprecedented. And so the point of what Cynthia is going to develop today, and I'm going to also develop, is that this is a long overdue, and we will look at 2 case studies. There's actually more, but we're going to look at 2 of the most recent and most powerful case studies of moments when humanity almost evolved to this win-win paradigm of mutual cooperation and recognizing that value is not located just in things or just in money, but that there's a higher state of value that exists that we have to make money obey, and the behavior of laws and economic structures obey. This will deal with some very interesting developments that have been almost completely scrubbed out of our history books from the 19th century. I'm going to tackle some elements that re-emerged in the period of World War II, a little bit before and a little bit afterwards, to get a sense that this multipolar idea is not just purely a Chinese-Russian innovation. This has its profound traditions in America. Its traditions are, because of what America actually is, more than just American, because America itself is not what you think it is, which is a discussion we can have afterwards, but I'll just say that provocatively. With that, I will end my little intro, and Cynthia can come up and deliver the first part of today's presentation.